Okay, good morning once again, everyone. First, I would
Morning.
like to welcome our participant from Avoidis Power, Energy Development Corporation, South Luzon Thermal Energy, and CDK to this webinar. Sir, ma'am, this new cybersecurity solution will be integrated alongside the products and services we've delivered over the years. Okay, we consider ourselves quite fortunate that a company from Israel, a nation friend of the Philippines, has chosen DESCO to be their partner and representative in the Philippines. Israel, since its founding in 1948, has not only survived but thrived despite facing numerous challenges, including in the field of cybersecurity. The history of resilience and innovation make their expertise in this field so valuable and trustworthy. So with that, it's our pleasure to introduce Ms. Daniela and Sir Ruby from CYE, who will be sharing their insights with us today.
Thank you so much. Great being here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so thumbs up that we have the screen up. Great. So thank you, Alan and the DESCO team for this really unique opportunity to address this, I say, very urgent need for a paradigm shift in cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and primarily for power plants. So, as you mentioned, I'm Daniela Parmata, the CMO of SAI, and I'm joined here with Ruby Ronashvili. He's the founder and CEO of SAI, and he knows firsthand the risk and the high cost of cyber threats and cyber attacks on society. Now, Ruby's early days in cybersecurity actually were in his military service, where he was, the first to establish the first ever Red Team unit in the Israeli Defense Forces. And the main point of that unit is to continuously assess where the military network is exposed, how to continuously validate it so that there is this operational continuity in order to ensure that Israel's critical network infrastructure is protected. And so we will, together we will address in this webinar now, this very exclusive session, the key trends and the threats in the energy utility companies. We'll share some actionable steps to take to embrace this paradigm shift in power plant cybersecurity. And the main goal that we want to ensure is that you know what to do next after we finish this webinar in order to ensure your operational continuity. So we'll start with a quick review of. Just let me make sure. Okay, quick review of the market. And when we look at the trends and just looking at the facts and the numbers, we've seen over the past 5 years a significant increase in cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, on utility organizations, and primarily in power plants around the world. The market data reflect a 4x growth in cyber attacks just in the past 5 years from 2020. If you look also at the growth and the rise year over year in cyber attacks against critical infrastructure organizations, we see that number rising by 30%, which is much higher than the 18% in total cyber attacks year over year. If you translate it of what it means just in the past 12 months and the amount of attacks globally on critical infrastructure organizations, we're talking about 420 million cyber attacks. If you think of it, it's 13 attacks every second. Those are huge numbers. And what we want to understand is how do we address this growing and faster than ever cyber attack escalation mode in the industry, because that some people already term them as the new geopolitical weapon. And so, Ruby, if I can, hand over to you to maybe explain what makes this, power generation organization such a prime target, and why now more than before?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Let's start with the basics. First of all, when you attack something like a power plant, like a utilities company, the impact is quite significant, right? Because when you attack a single organization and then there are, let's say, sometimes millions of people that are affected by that, that's something that you cannot ignore. The primary goal from the attacker perspective is how do I create as much as impact as possible so I can be first paid, because that's my number one target in most cases, or if that's a geopolitical kind of situation, then the impact is immediate, right? Because I'm able to paralyze an organization that then impacts the country or the nation quite immediately. Based on that, we see that, let's say, nation-sponsored players, whether those are commercial players or working for the government in, let's say, more nation-to-nation kind of an approach, in both cases, they gain exactly what they want to gain by actually attacking these kind of organizations. Again, huge impact, very critical and emergency mode that we'll see in some examples that we have for today, how even governments are being involved in these processes. And then the second question of why now, the reason for that, again, geopolitical situation in the world is changing very fast. We know that. We've seen that starting with Russia and Ukraine situation. We have an ongoing situation here in Israel that escalated not only for our neighbors, but also to Iran and some other places, so it becomes more global. And of course, there are some implications also in the eastern part of the world, the tension around China and the Chinese, let's say, neighbors there. That's something that is evolving as we go. Now, the main thing to remember is that those infrastructures, although being critical, the interesting thing about them is that still the basics, the basic foundations of cybersecurity are not there in place. Things like IT to OT transition, if you think about it, we see a lot of impact or a lot of effort being invested in IT security, and in some cases even in OT security. But even in the best cases that we've seen that IT is being treated as one single entity, OT is being treated as a second single entity. Now, what's the connection between them? That's exactly where the attackers hit, because that's the weakest link in the chain. And we'll talk about it more in some examples that we have today. The effect of, the utilities companies and the power plants being as part of the supply chain to others, that's exactly the point where attacking makes the most sense. And the last thing that we need to remember is that with the AI tools that we have today in the market, those attacks are becoming much easier. If in the past it required significant operation, people, affiliates, getting a lot of data and so on, today in a click of a button, you're able to get full target list with all the relevant weaknesses or potential weaknesses in those organizations and actually attack at scale. That's something that we'll refer to also as part of the presentation.
Yeah. So if we look really at those, you mentioned, how we're seeing more and more, impact in terms of even just the very recent notorious cyber attacks that we've seen in the industry. And when we look at, Colonial Pipeline in 2021, and the year after, the Tata Power, part of Tata Group in India, attacking more than 35 power plants around India. You mentioned the geopolitical Ukraine and Russian war, and we saw an attack on Ukraine's power grid in 23. Volt Typhoon, a China-linked cyber group attacking in the US, and even just recently with Tata-owned Jaguar Land Rover, that is actually still taking place today. So if if you'd like to maybe expand on maybe two or three of them, going into one of them specifically, like the Colonial Pipeline. Maybe if you can give a bit of more, well, like what happened behind the scenes with this cyber attack.
Yeah. Let me just start by saying that all the examples that you've given, those are the publicly known examples. I can tell you that for every known example, there are at least 5 others that are staying under the radar in a way, right? And that's something just to remember. So looking at the Colonial Pipeline situation, that's one of the most, I would say, iconic situations that we've experienced in the last years. The main reason for that is that it required actually President Biden to actually get in and support the organization, first by stating that the US is under emergency situation, which is not that easy for the president to declare, just to be very clear. And second, there was a government-to-government discussion between US and Russia to try and see whether they are able to relieve the situation. Now let's talk about what happened there. When you talk about the details, as I always say, it's all basic. What happened there is a simple user, VPN user, that is actually IT environment user, was then cracked, the password was cracked. There was no multi-factor authentication enabled for this user. And practically that's enough. Using this user, the attackers were able to get in. The user was a strong user. Again, another mistake, right? That you have too many permissions or very wide access to the environment. This user was able then to escalate privileges and move laterally in the organization from IT all the way to the ERP system, and from there to actually paralyzing completely the entire pipeline environment. 5,500 miles of pipelines were actually halted, and that's actually a decision that Colonial Pipeline made at the time. Now, keep in mind, they actually decided to pay the ransom, so almost $5 million that they paid, and still the operation was down for almost 6 days. If you remember the pictures in the news, the people are standing with their tanks, plastic tanks, to get some oil, gas, or solar or diesel. That was something that is, let's call it a reputational damage to the US. And more than that, the public atmosphere was really significantly higher than just the cost of the incident itself. And that's something that we need to remember. When you harm critical infrastructure, the public, the population kind of experience is so hard that they starting to get really escalated. I mean, the situation is escalated much faster than expected, although by definition, it's maybe not the worst thing that can happen to the US, and still, it felt like it's the end of day, right? The end of life for some people there. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you analyze the situation and you think about what this organization could have done better, right, in order to really prepare, there are 2 things that we can say very easily, and those are basic things. First, continuous evaluation of their exposure. That's something that you hear today. You hear us say that multiple times because, again, that's basic, that makes sense, and that's what every organization needs to do. That is a way to understand, first of all, where you're exposed, connect the technical risk to the business risk, and then being able to actually look at the organization as a single unit. Not only IT, not only application, not only cloud, not only identity. One organization, ecosystem that works together, that once you identify where the risk profile is, how that actually relates to the business, you are able to block the things on the spot before those are being exploited. That's one thing. Second thing, being prepared for an incident, and that's my advice. If there is one thing that you are getting out of this presentation today, you need to be prepared. Making decisions under pressure when the operation is down, usually, at least history shows that the decisions are not the best decisions that organizations made. For example, shutting down the pipeline just because of ERP situations, because, by the way, the pipeline was still valid and available. So actually, they could have used the pipeline, but for ERP reasons, for financial reasons, they decided to take down the operation, I'm not sure that that was the best decision ever. Second, paying the ransom without understanding the consequences, what should be done after the payment and so on, just paying without understanding the implications, that's another thing that can be, of course, exercised as part of, call it tabletop exercises, business continuity planning, and of course, incident readiness, which we, of course, recommend every organization to have handy, up and running at any given moment.
Yeah, and this is a key point that you mentioned. I remember there was a big debate that actually continued after that, whether one should pay the ransomware or not, and how do you make sure that you know already ahead of time that you're prepared, in which scenario you do pay and when you don't. So definitely a big lesson learned. The other one, when we have another, as you said, one public known cyber attack is the one that was carried out by the Volt Typhoon cyber group. That is actually more like an advanced persistent threat ATP group that is linked also to China, and as opposed to Colonial Pipeline, which was the entire east coast of the the network, the energy network, the east coast. This was actually an attack on a local utility power company in Littleton in Massachusetts.
Right.
And I wonder if you can share with us there, what is the key lessons that you take from this one?
So here's the most interesting thing here from my point of view, right? When you look at this type of an attack, you're asking yourself, what was the motivation of the attackers, right? So yes, it's clear, China-US kind of tension that's always in the background. We see US being today the #1 attacked country worldwide for different reasons. Now with President Trump, actually the numbers are rising, and that's something that is to be expected. But the shocking parameter here from my point of view is exactly what you see here on the top. 300 days that the attackers were in the organization, in the IT and OT environment, without getting noticed. That's, to me, something that organization cannot live with. In 300 days, you can actually do whatever you want in this organization. I'm not even talking about data, or data, let's say, call it exposure, right? Data exposure. It's not only that. You can think about data availability, data integrity. In some cases, that can be even much harder than just exposing the data. Think about what happens if you cannot trust your own data. But the main point is that today, with the capabilities that are out there in the market, actually in 300 minutes, you're able to actually take down an organization on its knees. So in 300 days, you can actually close the doors of the organization based on a cybersecurity attack that is sophisticated. Now, still, we see that these types of attacks, the reason that I'm saying that some of them are not getting public is that this one got public, but how many of similar activities we've seen out there that weren't taken public, there are multiple of those. And here's the interesting thing. Based on all of those attacks, something has changed in the US, and it started in the Colonial Pipeline situation. Today, there are regulations in the US based on the SEC that actually guarantees, in a way, that organizations will report everything that happens, let's say a material breach in the organization should be reported within 48 to 72 hours time frame. That means that organizations are now obligated to know what's going on in their organization. Organization that had a 300 days attack without knowing about it will be, of course, fined quite significantly by the US government as well, because it's not acceptable anymore. You need to know, you need to be able to identify, you need to be able to understand also the damage scope that you have in this kind of cases, and above all, to be able to recover in a way that keeps the operation up, and do that while cooperating with the relevant, let's say, ecosystem. In the US, it can be the FBI or some other law enforcement that is now, let's say, available to support this kind of situations. But again, as I said before, if you are just going through the basic concepts of identifying your risk, map the risk to the business risk, and then mitigate those items that are really the important items, and we'll talk about it in a second, how do you actually do that, then you're able to actually avoid this kind of situation completely. But 300 days is definitely not acceptable.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned how in America they addressed it also with a regulation. When you look at what is happening already today, this active cyber attack that is still taking place today on Tata's Jaguar Land Rover production line, it's still shut down. And when you talk about how the US regulator actually did that to ensure that the impact is managed and there isn't this massive shutdown, here when we look at the impact, it's huge. I mean, in the UK, the amount of jobs that are at risk due to the production being shut down. Is there anything you can share here that will share some insight that, because it's still ongoing?
And that's the main point, right? We started with 2021 Colonial pipelines. You can ask yourself, what did we learn from this experience? So yes, regulation changed. Government is more aware. US changed a lot in their overall mindset to support exposure management and business continuity planning and so on. Those are now part of the regulation. Those are now mandatory in organizations. And still, we see that in other places, such as in the UK, not only that they are not ready for cyber attacks, as mentioned, that is an attack that started last month or even before, and it's expected to last at least until November. Think about a quarter that a manufacturing site is closed. That's life-changing for an organization, and of course a risk for the organization to actually continue to exist, right? Think about the debt that they are generating at the moment. As you mentioned, 100K employees are at risk at the moment, not only in Land Rover, by the way, or Jaguar Land Rover, but also in their suppliers, in the retailers, and so on, because that's an ecosystem, right? All of them are now at risk. This kind of situation, and again, if you analyze what happened there, again, basic items, it's always the basics, always identity management, exposed interfaces to the outside, non-patched environments, phishing attacks. Again, it's nothing very sophisticated that you say, hey, we could not identify that or we could not protect against it. It's always basic foundations of cybersecurity. And that's maybe the main message here. With the right management of this situation, this thing could have been prevented as well.
So this is actually a very good segue to understand, you talk, it's like it's basics. It's not something new, it's managing the basics. So is the traditional cybersecurity ways, is that enough? Or if it isn't, what is required?
Yeah, so when we talk about cybersecurity, there are several aspects that are always important to take into consideration. And this is something that is being done today. First, talk about identity and access management. Second, internet perimeter. Then monitoring capabilities and so on. The problem that we see today is that those kind of, let's call it auditing, or this kind of assessment to the organization is being done in some organizations, not in all of them, unfortunately, but it's like static point-in-time evaluation. One of the things that has to change, right, is changing the paradigm from something that is either one-time or periodic to continuous. That's one. Second, when you identify a list of items, those are vulnerabilities, findings, weaknesses, misconfigurations. How do you decide what is important? The only way to do that is generating the organizational context, meaning trying to understand which of those vulnerabilities or weaknesses are actually first exploitable. Because if that's something that is not exploitable, there is no path to exploit it, it's not interesting, leave it aside. There's no reason to invest or waste resources on things that won't move the needle from the organization perspective. Second, understanding the business impact, that's key. Because if you have one risk that is going to generate a risk of 100K to the organization, and another risk that is going to generate a risk of 100 million, it's very simple to decide, right? When you see 100K and 100 million. But knowing that this is 100K and this is 100 million, that's a requirement today. Every organization needs to be able to do that. And again, it starts from the basics. As I mentioned before, identity management, network management, EDR, cloud environments, application environments, OT environments, all of those are important. And you find in an organization today, tens of tools that are out there. It's not that organizations are not using cybersecurity tooling, but getting the telemetry, getting those tools to work together and to get a single pane of glass, one picture showing you what is the organizational situation, that's one of the most important things to have. That's why integrating with the enterprise tool, as is mentioned in this presentation, will be key of being able to manage the cybersecurity exposure in the organization. So again, instead of just having one-time access or one-time evaluation of the organization, you're getting continuous evaluation. And then every time that something is exposed, a user is not enforced for multi-factor authentication. You're not waiting for that to being exploited and then paralyzing the entire East Coast in the US. You're actually able to identify that on the spot and mitigate in a proactive way, which leads to the last part. Everything that the concept of reactive security has to change, right? Everyone is talking about DR capabilities, whether it's XDR, MDR, NDR, EDR. All of those elements are by definition too late. It's detection and response. That means that something already happened. I'm not saying it's not important. It's extremely important, but as a second line of defense. First line of defense has to be proactive, data-driven, risk identification, exposure management, and mitigation. Everything that can be prevented will be much cheaper than things that needs to be then detected and responded to. Keep that in mind. If you mitigated and you prevented an attack, it's by definition cheaper than reacting to something that is happening already.
Right. And you mentioned also before the very key, the core of understanding the exposure and the assessing it and then continuously validating. You mentioned actually it's in the context. It's understanding the context as the core, because one power plant vulnerability is not equal to a different power plant's vulnerability. And also the threats that even they are targeting that specific industry and that specific sector, like critical infrastructure, is not necessarily the highest threat on my specific power plant.
Right.
And so this, maybe you can, share a bit of this triangle between the vulnerabilities, the business, as well as the threats that provide this unique context for every organization.
Of course. So, as you mentioned, context is key, right? Understanding, and this is the way to think about it. The first thing that you need to understand is your threat profile. Threat profile meaning, in simple words, what types of attackers are interested in my organization? What are they after? Why they are doing what they are doing? And then, of course, what will be the way that they attack the organization? All of those data items that I've mentioned are public knowledge. If you go to a project like MITRE, you'll get very clear understanding what types of attackers are out there, what are their TTPs, that's the techniques, tactics, and procedures that they are using, what they are targeting, what is the philosophy of attack, and what are the objectives. All of those items can be gathered very easily today. Then, when we understand what they are after, we understand whether they are trying to attack our type of an organization, yes or no, we can then translate their activities into technical items. Those will be, for example, phishing attacks. Those will be specific items that will be used in order to get remote access to the organization, and so on. Once we understand that, we understand how the intersection between threat profile and risk profile, those are the vulnerabilities that were mentioned before, are actually being taken into consideration. Then, when we know who is trying to attack us, what they're going to use, where we are weak, meaning where are our vulnerabilities, and what will be the impact to our business, assuming those are exploited, then we are able to prioritize in a smart way. Again, smart way meaning very simple. Let's identify those items that will get to the highest business impact. Mitigate those first and go down the line all the way to mitigation level that is now going to the acceptable risk level, which is another question in every organization that needs to be asked. What is the acceptable risk level? Because at some point, investing more in mitigation doesn't make sense anymore. Because sometimes you invest in mitigation higher amount than the actual risk that you have, and then you should stop and it doesn't make sense. One example to it will be, for example, patching SCADA or industrial control systems environments. We know that this is one of the highest or maybe the most exploited weaknesses that we've seen out there.
Right.
And still, does it make sense to mitigate the actual industrial control system environment? And we know that the answer is no, right? The reason for that, by the way, can be either you lose your warranty or you can actually halt the operation. So there are compensating methods to these situations. It doesn't mean that you don't need to take care of that. You don't need to ignore the situation, but instead of patching these specific systems, which can be extremely expensive and sometimes even, replacing the entire environment, which doesn't make sense because OT systems are built for 20, 30, 50 years, not like IT systems, and that's one of the main differences. Then you can actually create what we call a perimeter protection to the environment. And that's something that, again, it's not as good as actually patching, but it's good enough in some cases to reduce the risk to the acceptable risk level. So when you think about the triangle again, threat profile, risk profile, which are the vulnerabilities, and then the business impact, that's the context that we are looking in order to identify which items needs to be mitigated. And again, when it comes to the OT environment, as we've seen in the next slides, there are some aspects that are being taken into consideration, of course.
So Ruby, if we can move on to understanding what is the approach then, that the shift in the paradigm that you bring forward here, that you've already, you discussed some aspects of it, but if we try to condense it in, what are the key areas that we need to be aware of when we need to manage the risk in the critical infrastructure sector?
Yeah. So here's the point, right? It's true, by the way, for every business, but it's even more emphasized when we are talking about critical infrastructure or specifically a power plant. First thing that you need to understand, as I mentioned before, understand your threat profile. Before we even touch your organization, let's understand what's out there. That's something that has to be done continuously. Things are moving very fast in the industry. Vulnerabilities that are being utilized today can be completely different tomorrow. Now you have AI. In 2 or 3 years, you'll have quantum computing. Each and every one of those topics is changing the threat landscape. However, we'll talk about it in a second, the risk profile stays very similar, and we need just to adapt accordingly. So first, threat profiling. Just to be, again, very clear, what types of attackers, what TTPs that they are using, that means the actual activities, tools, and procedures that they are using in order to attack the organization. And then how that is being translated to your organizational risk. Then you need to understand where you are weak. In simple words, where are your vulnerabilities? When you understand where your vulnerabilities are, you can then reference them with the actual threat profile and understand which of the vulnerabilities are even in, let's say, in the play. And we'll show you that maybe in a second on how that looks like when you build your attack graph for the organization. Then, understanding the business impact, meaning let's connect the dots from the attacker all the way to our business impact. That means halting the operation. That means data exfiltration. That means reputational damage. That means employee information. That means safety issues. For example, if you're able to create some kind of safety situation in a power plant. All of those elements are being taken into consideration. Then you're able to make decisions around mitigation, meaning you're going from the highest impact items to the lowest impact items, and then choosing those elements that will be the most cost effective, meaning maximal risk reduction in minimal cost and effort. That's the formula. That's the call it the optimization problem that we are trying to actually balance, right? Again, risk reduction and cost and effort to mitigate. Once you're doing that, and you're going from a reactive approach to proactive approach and preventative approach, your cybersecurity program will be matured by definition. That means that you'll be above the noise level, and then the likelihood to attack the organization is going down, and that's the point. It's all about risk and exposure management. It's not that every organization can be resilient. Actually, we are saying the opposite. Every organization will be a target at some point. The question is, what is the impact then? Because if someone is in, but it was blocked very early in the process, then okay, there is no impact or very minimal impact. That's okay, something that we can live with. But if every user that is being leaked, like in the Colonial Pipeline situation, single user that was leaked caused millions or hundreds of millions, depending on how you look at it, even billions of actual impact, that's something that doesn't make sense and we cannot live with.
Yeah. So if you think of what the key items, if I just summarize what you mentioned, when we engage with customers, the first top outcomes that every organization needs to think about is around the business understanding, business profiling, then understanding the vulnerabilities, the risks, as well as the threat profiling that are relevant to that organization, but then also seeing the clarity and the visibility of the actual attack path. And I'd like to also address that very quickly, if we can, with you, just to see how we also do that on the platform itself, which we can, of course, after this webinar, engage separately with the people here and also show it live. But then that clarity is the one that defines what are the mitigation plans and actions that we should take that, as you said, would provide the highest impact on the business and reduce the amount of disruption to the operational continuity. And of course, all that has to be packaged and done in a continuous manner and continuously validated, as opposed to the traditional way of doing it, ad hoc and periodic. So if we look at some of the, the screens here that we've selected to show how Hive, the platform, would do that, Ruby, can you just walk us through the key areas that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So first of all, one of the things that we've changed when we started our approach, right, in the industry in general, is stop speaking in just qualitative approach, meaning a critical item. This data is not good enough anymore. Just saying something is critical, because critical can be 100K and can be 100 million, as I mentioned before. Which one is it, right? So being able to put a dollar value attached to a risk, that's something that changes everything in prioritization, because sometimes more investment in a single place will make much more sense than just spreading investments, for example, in different areas, just as one example. So first, being able to identify what will be the cost in the case of a cybersecurity related incident. As you can see here, the cost of breach data in the middle of the screen will be essential to understand. Second, what's the likelihood for that to happen? If in your organization you have a likelihood, like you see here in the demo platform, of 77%, you're in a very, very bad situation, right? Number should be much lower than that. Then exposure management, this is the number that we want to bring to minimal, right? So you can see here that industry benchmark in this case specifically would be 138 million, and the organizational exposure is more than 500 million. That's something that has to change. Now, how to change it? That's exactly the next slide. If we go to the next slide. So here's the point, right? The attack profiling or the attack map visualization that Daniela mentioned before, to us, that's a key element. On the left side, just to be very clear, those are the threat sources. What types of attackers, as I mentioned before, what are the TTPs and so on, that's being calculated on the left side. Those are the blue dots that you see on the left side of the graph. Then all the edges that you see in the graph itself, that's the intersection between TTPs coming from attackers and where the organization is actually vulnerable. So all of those elements that you see here, those are the actual attack routes that an attacker would be able to exploit in order to get to your business critical assets, which are then, you can see them on the right side, highlighted in red. Again, those can be business continuity, those can be safety, it can be reputational damage, it can be customer information, it can be supply chain attacks, and so on. All of those elements are being taken into consideration. Now, the highlights that you see in green, those are the edges that will provide the highest return on investment from mitigation perspective. Meaning, we don't need to mitigate the entire attack graph. That's really why this mathematical structure and everything that I mentioned until now is mathematically proven. So we are using graph theory algorithms here to make sure that every edge that is being identified for mitigation will yield in the end the highest return on the cybersecurity investment, and that's exactly what you see here. So being able to profile the data and put it in a structure that is not only visual, but also mathematically sound, from our point of view, that's the way to really optimize your resources and making sure that you are reducing cybersecurity risk and increasing the overall maturity by actually introducing this prioritized mitigation plan. So this mitigation plan will take into consideration all the identified edges that we've seen before, which will reduce the organizational risk, increase maturity, and make the organization really invest in the places that will create the highest return on the cybersecurity investment, as mentioned before. That is then something that can be, of course, also communicated, so with your management, with your board, and so on, and allows you, of course, to manage your organization as a group of companies and then get a very clear understanding of the entire group. Where is this? What is the situation? What is the overall maturity? And what are the commonalities between the different entities, business units, or subsidiaries in the group itself?
So thank you, Ruby. If we can maybe address one, two examples, or even just one example of maybe one of our customers that you wanted to point out here just before we go to our final slide and wrap the webinar.
Of course. So today we have customers ranging from the eastern part of the world all the way to the western part, let's say, to US, Canada, that implemented this approach in their environment. And we've seen organizations that were attacked on a monthly basis today actually working several years without any significant damage to their environment. How did they do that? The concept was very simple. We've integrated this concept that I've mentioned before based on the Hyver platform that we've shown in some screenshots to their IT and OT environment, making sure that everything that is being processed by the platform actually provides the organization with clear visibility. First, to where is the threat profile and risk profile, then correlated to the business impact, and then making sure that the investment is being made in the right places. We have companies that are power plants, we have companies that are nuclear facilities, we have companies that are manufacturing environments, we have water facilities, we have oil rigs and gas utilities that are all based on the same concept. If a significant attack is to happen there, the impact to the population or to their surroundings will be quite significant, whether by just disturbing their daily routines or by even risking the safety of the people around these specific facilities. And that's something that happens quite a lot. And I can tell you that we have customers now in Germany, for example, that are being targeted on a daily basis. We've seen very sophisticated attacks coming from, let's say, we call it Russian flavors that are coming to Germany, to Norway, to Sweden, and we see how those organizations that are actually utilizing our approach are able not only to stand against those attacks, but also to identify them in a very early stage of the attack and block them without any significant impact to the organization.
Thank you. So if we want to if we want to leave to have the people leave from this webinar with full tips that you can give everybody on how to actually implement and make sure that what they are looking for is what will serve their needs for operational continuity. What are those 4 main tips that you would give?
First one, maybe more generic than focus on your critical assets. Let's call it the context. We talked about it before. Understand your organizational context, meaning if you know where it hurts, if you know where it's going to hurt you the most, you'll be able to be at least prepared for that, right? If you don't know that and you are surprised, that's a very big situation, because attackers, they will find your pain point. If you'll find your pain point first time in an attack, you'll be in a situation that is very hard to manage. Second, we need to think about exposure and risk management as a concept of how do you reduce that to the possible minimum. We need to stop thinking about a dichotomic situation like black or white. Is it safe or not? There is no such thing in cybersecurity. It's all about risk management. What is the risk tolerance that you have in your organization? This is something that we need to take to the minimum. Meaning, even if something is to happen, we need to make sure that the cost or the impact of this situation will be minimized and definitely below the acceptable level in every organization. So exposure management is key. Understand your risk, understand the priority of what you're going to do, because by definition, you cannot do everything. It's just not possible. So focusing will be extremely important. Then, when you have the risk and threat profiling, when you have the assets identified, then you're able to mitigate in what we call evidence-led planning. This is a smart approach of being able to spot those items that will provide you with the highest return on investment, as we've seen in the attack graph that was mentioned before. And last but not least, for sure, business continuity plan. Tabletop exercises and exercising the organization to a crisis situation is key. You don't want to meet this kind of decisions under pressure for the first time when you are in an attack situation. You want to exercise that. You want to have scripts prepared before communication, data prepared before. You want to have everyone knowing their roles and responsibilities in case of a cybersecurity incident before that happens. If you have that in place, I can guarantee that your cost of incident will be minimized. The reason for that is that if this is a number or a statement to remember, the cost of an incident grows exponentially with time. Every day that you have of an incident, it's not going to be equal to the day before. It's going to be much more. Every day will be at least twice the cost of the accumulated cost of what happened before. This is something to remember. If you're able to save even 1 minute, it's going to save money for you. So everything that can be prepared up front should be prepared up front. If you take those 4 elements and implement them in your organization, I can guarantee that the cybersecurity maturity and risk of your organization will be lower, and that's something that will help your organization be prepared and ready for the next unfortunate situation that might happen in your organization.
Thank you, Ruby. This has been extremely valuable. I leave here the final sort of takeaways for everybody to see. I see there's someone who also who has risen their hand for a question. And since we have limited time, I will leave the final messages here. And if you'd like to ask your question, please do, so we can still address it.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we believe in what you says about risk-based approach in the mitigation. But question is, how do you protect yourself from the ones that's supposed to protect you, but then they are the ones who cause trouble? For example, the CrowdStrike that happened. What year was this? 2024. So
Yep.
what's your take on that?
So supply chain in general, right? Those are your partners, your vendors, and so on. Supply chain is one of the risks that you need to take into consideration. When we talk about threat profiling, it's not only the attackers like DarkSide or Klopp Group and so on. Those are also your vendors. And here is the problem that you have today in the industry. Today, when you're doing vendor management, there are very good tools out there to do what we call a third-party risk profiling, like BitSight, Security Scorecard, and so on. They are giving you a specific let's say, number. This is some kind of score that that tells you, okay, this vendor is risky or not. And here is exactly the point. This question is really to the point, because this is the point of context. If you don't understand what is the impact of this vendor to your organization, having a score of 700, 900, or 800 is not going to change anything from your organization. Alternatively, if you know that this vendor is now connected to your OT environment, just as an example, you are working with Siemens. Again, we have nothing against Siemens, of course. You're working with Siemens, and then Siemens, their field engineers, they have remote access using VPN to their environment. If Siemens employee is now compromised, you have an issue. If you understand that, you understand that this is the situation, and you understand that Siemens is now a risk to your organization, you can put the relevant controls in place. For example, 4 eyes concept, meaning Siemens is not able to connect to your environment whenever they want without your permission. And then you have, for example, zero trust network access that provides them access only with 4 eyes concept, meaning you need to be there and the vendor needs to be there at the same time. That's one. To your question, just to make it clear, when you understand the context and you're able to draw the line between your vendors to your assets, you're able also to put the mitigation items in place. In any case, if you understand the risk and threat profile, you're able to act upon it. So your question is true. One thing that you need to remember, and that's really what you said, in other words, you cannot trust your vendors blindly. Every vendor is a risk to your organization, including ourselves, right? And we say that very clearly. When we come to an organization, we are a potential risk to the organization as well. How do you mitigate this risk? That's the question that we need to answer. Meaning, let's identify the risk profile, create the relevant attack vectors to identify that, and then put the mitigation in place to make sure that that's not a real attack vector.
So it's very important to include the vendors as well in the assessment, right? Okay, that's
of course.
And also do it in a continuous assessment of the vendors, because the first time that you assess them, they also develop with time, and your organization also develops with time. Your own attack surface also develops. And so this context needs to continuously update itself, and the threat of that specific supplier has to continuously also be assessed and validated.
Yeah, but I was referring to incident of CloudStrike.
Yes.
It's a big company, but then what happened. So
yeah, in this case, it wasn't at least they say it wasn't a cybersecurity attack. It was more, let's say, a shutdown situation, but the impact was the same impact, right? Whatever the reason is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Are there any more questions? I see we have 2 minutes left. Okay, so thank you, Ruby, and thank you, the DESCO team, and thank you everybody for coming on and listening, and also asking, and also thank you for rejoining after being disconnected. It's we appreciate your time and the attention, and thank you, Mr. Olan.
Yes, okay, thank you. Mr. Buddy, thank you. Ma'am Wendy, thank you for your time. Okay.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good day, everybody.